All right, welcome back everybody. This is our NTI Day 2 instruction for social studies as I continue reading the text 2 Miserable Presidents. So today we are going to pick up in the middle of the first chapter, which was How to Rip a Country Apart. So if you want to make sure you have your stuff, and I'm going to get started on page 10. So at the bottom of page 10, we start with step number 6, get more land. Speaking of getting angry, the North and South soon had something else to fight over, more land. By 1848, the United States looked like this. Then gold was discovered in California, and thousands of miners raced west, dreaming of quick riches. Suddenly, California had enough people to become a state, and it wanted to enter the Union as a free state. At this time, there were 30 states, 15 free states, and 15 slave states. Was California going to upset this careful balance? Not if Southerner leaders could help it. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi summed up Southern fears. For the first time, we are about to permanently destroy the balance of power between the sections. Some Southern members of Congress began to talk openly of disunion, the breakup of the United States. This might be a great time to pause and answer question number 5. Step number 7, try to compromise. Hold on, said Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky. We can work this out. Clay offered a compromise designed to keep the peace between the North and South. The two most important points were these. California will be admitted to the United States as a free state. Congress will pass the Fugitive Slave Act, which will make it easier for slave owners to catch escaping slaves. By 1850, though, a lot of people didn't feel like compromising anymore. Senator John C. Calhoun from South Carolina declared that the Union could be saved only if the North met the Southern demands. Stop helping escaped slaves, stop the abolitionist movement, and promise to keep the balance between free states and slave states. He was too sick to give a long speech. He actually died a month later. But he sat in the senator chamber, a blanket over his legs, while a fellow senator read his emotional words. The South asks for justice, simple justice, and less she ought not to make. Senator William Stewart of New York rejected Calhoun's demands. Slavery was going to end whether Calhoun liked it or not, Stewart insisted. And there was no way that he was going to allow slavery to spread into California or any other new territory. I cannot consent to introduce slavery into any part of this continent, which is now exempt from what seems to me such a great evil, Stewart said. This was all part of a months-long argument that included a few fistfights on the Congress floor. At one point, Senator Henry Foote of Mississippi actually pulled out a pistol and aimed it at Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton. I have no pistol, Benton shouted. Let him fire! Stand out of the way and let the assassin fire! Foote didn't fire. In the end, most members of Congress agreed with Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Webster spoke passionately in favor of keeping the peace between the North and South. I wish to speak today, not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Congress eventually agreed to the compromise outlined by Henry Clay. The Compromise of 1850, as it was called, the Union is saved, shouted people in the streets of Washington, D.C. Unfortunately for the Union, the Compromise of 1850 made people madder than ever. Step 8, chase fugitives. According to the tough new Fugitive Slave Act, any African American suspected of being a fugitive slave could be captured and dragged before a judge. The accused person had no right to testify, and no right to a trial by jury. The judge simply decided if this person was really a runaway slave. The judge got $5 if he set the person free, and $10 if he sent the person into slavery. This is horrible, by the way. Sounds terrible. Anyway, go ahead and pause and go ahead and answer question number 4. Okay, I'm going to continue here at the bottom of page 13. Many Northerners, even if they had not been abolitionists before, howled in anger at what they saw as cruel and unjust law. And escaped slaves living in the North knew they were in serious danger. Just ask Henry Brown. A year before, Brown had escaped from slavery by packing himself into a small wooden crate in Richmond, Virginia, and instructing his friends to mail him to an abolitionist office in Philadelphia. The friends wrote, "This side up, with care," on the crate. But the people handling the box didn't pay much attention, and Brown spent several miserable hours upside down. After a 26-hour train ride, Brown, dying of heat and thirst, heard people prying open the box. He had no way of knowing where he was. So as the top of the crate was lifted, it was with tremendous joy that he looked up and saw 4 fairly confused Philadelphia abolitionists staring down at him. Brown stood up, reached out his hand, and said, "Good morning, gentlemen." Soon after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, Henry Brown, now famous as Henry Box Brown, was attacked and nearly captured in Providence, Rhode Island. He managed to beat up the kidnappers, but he knew he could be grabbed at any moment. He got on a ship and sailed to Britain. This would be a great place to pause and answer the last part of question number 6. This one asked for 3 different examples of people who had been slaves and escaped from slavery. So what we just read is going to help you get your last person there for question number 6. All right, step number 9, write books. Henry Brown was lucky. Most fugitives didn't have rich friends to buy them tickets to Europe. Slave catchers stalked the streets of northern cities, kidnapping enslaved slaves, sometimes even African Americans born free in the North. A writer named Harriet Beecher Stowe was so mad she had to do something. But what? Her sister-in-law gave her an idea. "Hattie, if I could use a pen as you can, I would write something that will make this whole nation feel what an accursed thing slavery is." Stowe began writing a book, working at night after putting her 6 children to bed, at the kitchen table in her family's house in Maine. In her novel, which she called Uncle Tom's Cabin, Stowe tried to make readers feel the horrors of slavery. She forced parents to imagine what it would be like to see a slave trader coming to buy their only child. If it were your Harry, Mother, or your Willie that were going to be torn from you by a brutal trader tomorrow morning, if you had seen the son, seen the man, and heard that the papers were signed and delivered, and you had only from 12 o'clock till morning to make your escape, how fast could you walk? How many miles could you make in those few brief hours? Published in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin broke readers' hearts, inspiring many in the North to hate slavery like never before. Offended Southern writers fired back with books of their own, arguing that slaves in the South were actually well treated and happy. They insisted that Northern factory workers were much worse off than enslaved African Americans. Step 10, divide Nebraska. With tension between North and South reaching new heights, we now turn back to the most explosive issue, what to do with all that western land. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois thought it was time to divide the huge Nebraska territory into smaller territories that could become states. But there was a problem. All this land was north of the line drawn in the Missouri Compromise. Remember step 3. So it could only be made into free states. Southern senators would never allow this, Douglas knew. Douglas proposed a solution. We'll throw out the Missouri Compromise and make a whole new deal called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We'll divide the territory in 2, Nebraska in the north and Kansas in the south. And we'll let the people who actually settle in these territories vote on whether or not they wanted slavery. Congress passed the Nebraska-Kansas Act in 1854, and President Franklin Pierce signed it into law. Now, before I go on, you might want to pause and answer question number 7. Okay, I'm at the top of page 17. Douglas really thought this would stop the North and South from fighting over slavery in the territories. After all, now it was up to the settlers themselves to decide the slavery question. That was democracy, right? Self-government? Who could be against that? Actually, lots of people. When Douglas went home to give a speech in Chicago, an angry crowd shouted at him for 2 solid hours, finally driving him off the stage. In Peoria, Illinois, people were calm enough to listen to Douglas's defense of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Then a lawyer and former member of Congress named Abraham Lincoln rose to respond. Lincoln was so tall and skinny, people said it looked as if he unfolded as he stood up. Lincoln launched his attack based on one simple idea. There can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. Slavery was wrong, he argued, and they should not allow it to spread into new territories. Did white people really have the right to vote on whether or not they could own black people? This was really self-government, or was it? When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. But whether Lincoln liked it or not, the people of Kansas were going to vote on the slavery question. Which side would win? That would depend on who got there first. Step 11, race to Kansas. Supporters and opponents of slavery set off on a race to Kansas. New England abolitionist groups sent money and guns to anti-slavery settlers. But the pro-slavery side had an advantage. The slave state of Missouri was right next to Kansas. The Missouri Senator David Atkins took a vacation from Congress to personally lead Missouri men into Kansas. There are 1,100 men coming over from Plate County, Missouri, to vote, he said. And if that ain't enough, we can send 5,000, enough to kill every blanking abolitionist in the territory. And sure enough, just as Kansas was about to elect its first government, 5,000 Missouri men rode in and voted. Illegally. Since the only real residents of Kansas were supposed to vote, the new legislature quickly legalized slavery in Kansas. Calling this government the bogus legislature, anti-slavery settlers held their own election. The anti-slavery settlers, also known as free soilers, chose their own government and, of course, banned slavery. So by the beginning of 1856, Kansas had 2 different governments meeting in 2 different cities. Both sides were storing up weapons and organizing armies. Luckily, that winter was bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping into the 29-degree below zeros. Most people stayed inside. But by May, it was warm enough to fight. An 800-man pro-slavery army marched to Lawrence, home of the Free Soilers' government. The invading army chased out the Free Soil leaders, dumped 2 newspaper printing presses into the Kansas River, and fired a cannon at the Free State Hotel. The hands of Northerner readers shook with fury as they read the next day's newspapers. Startling news from Kansas. The war actually begun. Lawrence in ruins. Several persons slaughtered, shouted the headlines of the New York Tribune. Actually, no one was slaughtered. The one pro-slavery man died when a chunk of the Free State Hotel fell on his head. This would be a good time to stop and answer question number 8. Step 12, insult senators. No one was angry about the events in Kansas than Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. In a speech he called the crime against Kansas, Sumner called the pro-slavery army murderous robbers from Missouri, picked up from the drunken spew and vomit. He also slammed senators who supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, saving his most personal attack for Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Sumner charged Butler with loving slavery and also hinted that Butler stammered and spat when he talked. This was a low blow, since Butler had difficulty speaking due to a stroke that he had that left him partially paralyzed. Even Sumner's friends were a bit offended, and Butler's friends were exploding with rage. That brings us all the way back to the point where we began, with the cane-swinging Congressman Preston Brooks. Step 13, hit him again. Preston Brooks was Senator Butler's cousin. 2 days after Sumner's speech, Brooks walked into that Senate chamber looking for revenge. He strode up to Sumner's desk and declared, "I have read your speech twice over, carefully. It is libel," that's a false or harmful statement, "on both South Carolina and Senator Butler, who is a relative of mine." Then Brooks began beating Sumner on the head with his metal-tipped cane. Blood flowed down Sumner's face as he tried to wriggle his long legs out from under his desk, which was screwed into the floor. Sumner finally ripped off the desk, along with some of the floor, and stumbled to the ground. Brooks continued smacking Sumner until his cane snapped and he was yanked away by other members of Congress. Brooks was thrilled to find that his attack on Sumner made him a hero in the South. "Every Southern man is delighted," he boasted. One Virginia newspaper commented, "The only regret we feel is that Mr. Brooks did not employ a horsewhip instead of a cane." Dozens of Southerners sent him new canes, some with cute sayings on them such as, "Hit him again." Northerners were stunned by this reaction. One member of Congress had beaten another nearly to death and was considered a hero. Now you know why Brooks attacked Sumner, and you can see that the events leading up to this attack were splitting the country apart. The conflict between the North and South was bitter, personal, and a little bit bloody. It was about to turn seriously violent. All right, that's it.